They thought they could steal everything from a grieving widow, unaware that her late husband had left behind a poison pill worth millions in debt. They didn't just lose their inheritance, they lost their entire future. You have to see the shocking end of this cold, calculated revenge. They called it an inheritance. I called it a death sentence. When my husband, Floyd, passed away, the air in our home didn't just turn cold, it turned predatory. Before the funeral flowers had even begun to wilt, his two sons, Sydney and Edwin, were already circling like vultures. They didn't come to grieve. They came to strip away the foundation of everything I had built over 22 years of marriage. They stood in my living room, eyes devoid of sorrow, and laid out their demands with the clinical precision of an executioner. The estate, the business, the properties. They wanted it all, and they wanted me to accept the crumbs they called a settlement. My lawyer, a man who had seen it all, looked at me with genuine fear in his eyes. He begged me to fight, to drag them into court and tear them apart for their insolence. I looked him dead in the eye, and with a voice that didn't tremble, I said, "Give it all to them." Everyone, including the boys and their shark-like attorney, thought I had finally lost my mind. They thought the grief had broken me, that I was a weak, elderly woman ready to be discarded. At the final hearing, I signed the papers. I watched the greed dance in their eyes, that sickening, triumphant spark that only truly hollow people possess. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully erased me from their father's legacy, reducing me to an inconvenience to be managed with the bare minimum of legal requirements. But as their lawyer began to read the final terms, the color drained from his face until he turned ghost white. He saw what they were too arrogant to realize, and what I had known from the very beginning. Welcome to Tales of Justice, where we peel back the layers of human greed to uncover the truth. Before we dive into the wreckage of this family, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button. Your support is the heartbeat of this channel. It allows me to keep digging, keep analyzing, and keep bringing you these stories that expose the reality behind the closed doors of the wealthy. By subscribing, you are telling me that you want to stand against those who thrive on manipulation and betrayal. Let's do this together. There is a lesson here, one that I have had to learn the hard way. It is a lesson about the illusion of family. For 22 years, I lived in a world where I thought we were building something eternal. I treated Sydney and Edwin like my own, through the holidays, the business crises, and the quiet, intimate moments of our lives. Yet, the moment the patriarch was gone, the mask fell off. Sydney, the eldest, wore his father's death like an expensive, tailored suit, designed to give him an advantage, not to honor a man. His steel-gray eyes evaluated me not as a mother, but as a bad investment that needed to be liquidated. And Edwin, the younger brother, was arguably worse. A man who hid his malice behind a veil of synthetic, dripping sympathy. They spoke of bloodline with such repulsive entitlement, as if genetics were the only currency that mattered in a marriage of 2 decades. Have you ever looked at someone you loved and realized they were waiting for you to stumble? That is the essence of financial abuse. It is not just about the money. It is about the cold, systematic erasure of your worth. They tried to make me feel small. They tried to make me feel like my presence in their father's life was a transaction that had simply expired. They used words like practical to justify their cruelty, effectively gaslighting me into believing that my security was a favor, not a right. They were not there during the long, agonizing months when Floyd's health was failing. They were not the ones holding his hand through the treatments, the fear, and the final breaths. I was alone in those trenches. And yet, they had the audacity to return with manila folders and legal threats to tell me how I should live the rest of my days. They saw me as a target, an easy mark, because I was a woman who didn't possess their aggressive, shark-like business acumen. They were wrong. And as you sit there, listening to this, I want you to consider how often we allow people to treat us as less than we are because we choose to value harmony over conflict. But there comes a point where harmony becomes a trap. When the people you love decide that your life is worth less than their next payday, you have to stop being the victim. You have to start being the architect of your own survival. This wasn't just a battle over property. It was a battle for my soul, and Sydney and Edwin were about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. But their arrogance was exactly what left the door wide open for the truth to walk in, completely unseen by their greedy eyes. As the silence settled over Floyd's office after their departure, the weight of my new reality felt like it might finally crush me. Yet within that suffocating stillness, something inside me ignited. A quiet, ferocious shift from the grieving widow they expected to the woman Floyd had actually spent 22 years preparing. My hands, trembling not with fear but with a newfound, sharp-edged resolve, drifted to the small, mahogany drawer in Floyd's desk, the one place he always kept his most personal, private treasures. Tucked away beneath a stack of mundane receipts and long-forgotten business cards, my fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and entirely out of place. A small, worn brass key that seemed to hum with a secret language of its own. I stared at that key as if it were a compass, wondering why Floyd would hide something so significant in the very heart of the workspace where his sons believed they held all the power. Watching them through the office window, I saw Sydney and Edwin standing by their luxury car, their heads pressed together in a conspiracy of celebration, clearly already carving up the inheritance they were so eager to seize. They were so busy counting money they didn't even have that they never once glanced back at the house where their stepmother sat alone, seemingly in ruins. It was in that moment, as I watched them drive away, that I realized the profound irony of their position. They were so blinded by their own performance of victory that they were utterly incapable of seeing their own defeat. I need you to understand why this moment was the absolute turning point in my life, because it wasn't just about finding a physical object. It was about the psychological realization that I was no longer the person they had spent years trying to diminish. I stopped being the quiet, compliant, grieving wife and began to view Sydney and Edwin not as the children of my husband, but as dangerous, calculated opponents who had underestimated the very person who knew their father best. I spent the next 48 hours in a relentless, methodical search of every corner of our home, stripping away the layers of our life to find whatever lock this mysterious key was meant to open. Each empty cabinet and drawer I encountered only sharpened my focus, reminding me that if they wanted to play a game of hidden agendas, I was more than ready to be the one to deal the final hand. My meeting with Martin Morrison, our long-term attorney, stands out in my memory as the moment I truly stepped into my own power, even though he saw it as an act of absolute resignation. He looked at me with such profound, professional concern when I calmly instructed him to prepare the documents to give them everything they wanted, warning me that a legal contest would be a grueling, life-altering path of exhaustion and bitterness. He was a good man, but he was operating under the assumption that I was a victim seeking legal rescue, when in reality, I was a strategist gathering intelligence. I didn't tell him about the key, because I knew that in this game, the fewer people who held the truth, the tighter the grip I would have on the outcome. As I walked out of that skyscraper lobby and into the bright, indifferent sunlight of Sacramento, I caught my reflection in the polished glass of the building, and for the first time in over 2 decades, I didn't see the woman who had lived solely to support Floyd or to manage the egos of his sons. I saw someone who looked back at me with a steady, unbreakable intensity. A woman who was becoming more present and more substantial with every passing second. This is the hardest part of the lesson I am sharing with you. When you are under attack, especially by those closest to you, the impulse to react with immediate, panicked defense is a trap that keeps you in the role of the victim. True survival requires the courage to pause, to breathe, and to let your enemies believe they have already won, because that is the exact second when they lose their guard and show you exactly who they are. Floyd had left me a message, a lifeline of sorts, and I could feel it in my bones that this key was his final promise that I would never be left to fend for myself in the ruins of their greed. I felt a strange, cold clarity washing over me, a realization that the 30-day clock they had imposed on my life was not a countdown to my displacement, but a deadline for their own undoing. Every action I took from that day forward, every step I walked, was a deliberate, silent move in a game they didn't even realize they had already lost, and I was perfectly content to let them keep their illusion of victory for just a little while longer. With the key safely in my purse and my strategy firmly taking root, I headed into the very lion's den. A dinner invitation at Granite Bay that was never about family, but entirely about intimidation. Pulling into the circular driveway of Edwin and Bianca's home, I was struck by the grotesque monument they had built to their own vanity, a sprawling estate that screamed of borrowed money and a desperate, fragile success. Everywhere I looked, I saw the markers of their hollow world. A new luxury BMW here, a Mercedes there. Each vehicle a testament to the debt-fueled lifestyle they were so eager to sustain at the expense of their father's legacy. As I stepped onto their porch, I took a long, steady breath, preparing myself to play the role they had cast me in. The grieving, confused, and easily managed stepmother. All while knowing exactly how precarious their existence had become. Bianca opened the door. A masterclass in performative hospitality. Her designer dress more expensive than my entire monthly grocery budget. Her highlights and manicured nails all evidence of an aesthetic upkeep that cost more than most people's retirement plans. She kissed the air near my cheek, her concern for my well-being as artificial as the jewelry that weighed down her wrists. But I met her performance with my own, offering a soft smile and a gentle tone that only encouraged them to believe they had already won. As we moved into the study where Sydney waited, scotch in hand, the dark wood paneling and leather furniture seemed to mock the reality of their situation, projecting an image of power that I now knew was built on a foundation of crumbling, failed investment schemes and rampant gambling losses. They moved around me with an ease that felt like a trap, offering me wine, appetizers, and inquiries about my well-being, their voices dripping with that sickening, patronizing warmth they reserved for those they were about to fleece. I sat there, watching them as if I were a ghost at my own feast, observing the way Sydney leaned forward to speak, his posture full of that casual arrogance that had defined his life, while Edwin bustled about with a false energy that betrayed his hidden desperation. It was a masterful performance, and had I not spent those last 48 hours submerged in the cold, hard truths of their financial ruin, I might have actually found myself touched by their apparent concern for my future. But as we sat in the formal dining room, the heavy silverware and the museum-quality china serving as the backdrop to our final performance, I realized that I was no longer an outsider looking in. I was the one holding the only real information in the room. When Sydney finally broke the silence, his voice smooth as glass, to mention that Martin Morrison had called him to say I was ready to move forward with the estate transfer, the relief that flooded Edwin's face was almost comical in its intensity. That was my moment. The instant where the game shifted, and I allowed myself a delicate, thoughtful bite of the salmon Bianca had spent hours preparing before I looked up and introduced the one thing they couldn't control, the truth about those medical bills. I told them that $180,000 was a substantial amount, and that, as his wife, I felt a duty to have an accountant review the estate's liquid assets before I personally committed to such a debt. The temperature in that room didn't just cool, it plummeted, and I watched the way Sydney's hand tightened around his wine glass, the way Edwin's fork stuttered against his plate, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden, suffocating quiet. They tried to steer the conversation back to the safety of their narrative, insisting that the probate process was already decided and that the medical expenses were my sole responsibility, their voices rising with a desperate, practiced neutrality that I had seen 1,000 times before. I let them talk, let them pile on their lies, and then I leaned in and mentioned, as if it were a mere afterthought, that I had been going through Floyd's office and found documents that didn't quite add up. Bank statements for accounts I hadn't recognized, and that small, mysterious brass key I had found in his desk. The color didn't just drain from Edwin's face. It vanished, leaving behind a gray, hollow shell of the man who had been so confident only moments before. I watched them trade glances, that silent, terrified language of co-conspirators who have finally realized the foundation beneath them is rotting, and for the first time, I allowed myself to see the sheer panic they were struggling so hard to suppress. I told them, with a pleasant, almost naive smile, that I felt it was my duty as Floyd's widow to understand our financial situation before I signed anything, because after all, I would be managing on my own from now on. Bianca fled to the kitchen in a flurry of nervous energy, her excuse about dessert being as thin as her pretense of care, and in that vacuum, I watched Sydney try to regain his footing, his voice strained and brittle as he warned me against listening to misleading advice from people who didn't understand the law. He tried so hard to play the protective son, the man who only wanted to save me from the confusion of paperwork, his words a desperate attempt to regain control over the narrative he had so carefully crafted to suit his own ends. I didn't break, I didn't get angry, and I didn't defend myself. I simply maintained that pleasant, steady smile, telling him that family should always help family. All the while knowing that by the time I was back in my car, he would be on the phone, spiraling into the chaos he had invited upon himself. I drove away from that house of cards, feeling not the despair I had been carrying since the funeral, but a cold, crystalline focus that told me the game was no longer being played on their terms. By the time I reached home, the phone was already ringing with the call I knew would come. The sound of final, rhythmic drumbeat marking the end of their illusion of victory and the beginning of the end of the Whitaker family's reign of greed. As the final echoes of that disastrous dinner faded into the distance, I knew I was moving past mere observation and into the heart of the storm, where the true extent of their betrayal would be unmasked. I arrived at the modest office of James Mitchell, a man whose lived-in workspace was the polar opposite of the clinical, polished environment where Martin Morrison had failed me so profoundly. Mitchell himself was not the type of attorney who courted clients with expensive suits and grand promises. He was a man of quiet, sharp competence, with eyes that seemed to have seen every variation of human greed and hands that suggested he had built his reputation on the kind of work that doesn't get featured in glossy brochures. As I sat in his worn leather chair, the letter from Floyd still tucked securely in my purse, Mitchell began to reveal the scope of a strategy that had been unfolding in the shadows for months, an investigation that was both the most painful and the most enlightening experience of my entire life. He opened a file that looked like the summary of a lifetime of deception, filled with documents that corroborated every suspicion I had dared to whisper to myself in the dark. Mitchell explained that Floyd had not just been a man waiting for his end. He had been a man who, in his final months, was carefully, methodically, and brilliantly turning the tables on the very people he had once called his sons. It was here, amidst the copies of forged loan documents and surveillance photographs of Sydney squandering family wealth in the high-stakes casinos of Reno, that I finally understood why Floyd had chosen me as his final, most powerful instrument of justice. He hadn't just been protecting me. He had been constructing a trap, a mechanism designed to catch them in their own web of lies, and his absolute, unwavering faith in my capacity to carry this out was more moving than any inheritance could ever be. The most jarring revelation, however, was the financial landscape of the properties I had been so worried about losing. For Mitchell showed me clearly that they were leveraged to their breaking point. Floyd had taken out massive mortgages on both the family home and the Lake Tahoe villa, not because he was struggling, but because he knew exactly what his sons would prioritize once he was gone. They were not inheriting assets. They were inheriting a debt crisis that they were entirely ill-equipped to manage, given their own crumbling personal finances. Mitchell walked me through the bank statements for Whitaker Holdings LLC, a $4.7 million treasure trove of liquid assets that they hadn't even known existed, and the original, final version of a will that Mitchell had been holding securely, a document that stripped away their false sense of entitlement and left the ultimate fate of their inheritance entirely in my hands. Seeing the truth laid out on his desk, I felt a wave of clarity that was almost intoxicating, because it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the power to force them to look into the mirror and finally see the people they had become. Floyd had left me a note in the margin of the will, a final, poignant instruction that I should use my own wisdom and judgment to determine what they truly deserved, effectively handing me the pen to write the conclusion of their story. The fact that the life insurance was actually $800,000 and not the measly sum they had led me to believe was simply the final layer of protection he had built, a cushion to ensure that I would never be tethered to their misery. Every document Mitchell showed me, the forged signatures, the embezzled client funds, the records of them discussing how to manipulate a dying man, was an indictment of a moral rot that went far beyond mere money, a betrayal of the very concept of family that they had so loudly touted. I sat there in that windowless office, the weight of the past 22 years finally starting to lift as I processed the absolute, unwavering love behind Floyd's long-term plan. He had been alone in his own realization, carrying the secret of their character while he was in the hospital, and yet he had managed to secure my future with a level of foresight that was nothing short of miraculous. When my phone buzzed with a frantic, desperate message from Sydney, sensing that the tide had irrevocably turned against them, I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I felt only the cold, sharp focus of someone who has finally found their footing on solid ground. They had spent years assuming that I was a pawn they could discard at their leisure, never once considering that their own father might have seen through them. I looked at the business card for Mitchell and Associates and knew that the final act was about to begin, and for the first time since Floyd had died, I was not just ready. I was eager to see them face the reality of the consequences they had so carefully cultivated. The game of manipulation was over, and the game of accountability had officially started, and I was holding all the cards. The finality of their defeat was not found in the courtroom, but in the silence that followed, a stillness so profound it finally allowed me to exhale and begin the long, restorative work of discovering who I was outside the shadow of the Whitaker name. Moving to that charming, weather-beaten cottage in Carmel was the first act of a life truly chosen rather than assigned, where the only expectations I had to navigate were the rhythms of the Pacific tide and the slow, deliberate growth of the roses I planted in my garden. The $1.2 million price tag for that cottage was paid in cash, a number that meant nothing compared to the sensation of waking up every morning without the crushing weight of someone else's malice sitting on my chest. I spent my days not in the frantic, performative world of legal maneuvers and social obligations, but in the peaceful, tactile labor of pruning, planting, and nurturing a legacy that was, for the first time, entirely my own. I often think about Sydney and Edwin in those quiet evening hours when the fog rolls in from the ocean, and while the reports from my attorney say that Sydney is filing for bankruptcy and Edwin is working a night shift at an airport hotel, I feel no desire to reach out or intervene. Their downfall was not a cruelty I inflicted upon them, but the inevitable consequence of a moral architecture that was built on theft and deception long before I ever entered their lives. Bianca, meanwhile, has moved on to a life in Los Angeles that seems a world away from the Granite Bay estate she fought so hard to possess. A reminder that the bonds we once called family were often just alliances of convenience that shattered the moment the convenience evaporated. It is a strange thing to realize that I spent 22 years trying to build a bridge into their world, only to find that the distance was never about geography, but about a fundamental, unbridgeable difference in the value we placed on integrity and human connection. I often wonder if Floyd, looking down from whatever perspective he now holds, would approve of the way I have channeled his legacy into something so far removed from the cold, clinical world of business and estate planning he once inhabited. Then I remember the letter he left in that safety deposit box, the careful, painstaking way he documented the truth to protect me, even when he knew he wouldn't be there to witness the aftermath. He didn't just give me the financial security to walk away. He gave me the permission to believe that my own intuition was valid, that the discomfort I felt for 2 decades was not a failing on my part, but a compass pointing toward the truth I had been too afraid to acknowledge. Every time I deadhead the roses that bloom in the exact succession he and I once designed, I feel a connection to him that feels more authentic than any anniversary dinner or corporate gala we ever attended. My work with the Floyd Whitaker Foundation for Financial Justice began almost by accident when a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, James Mitchell's daughter, stopped by my gate and asked if I would be willing to share my story with victims of similar abuse. Sitting across from her, listening to her talk about the systemic ways that predators isolate and silence women within their own families, I realized that my survival was not a destination, but a resource I had an obligation to share. I wasn't just a woman who had come through the fire. I was a living archive of how the game of financial manipulation is played, and that insight is the most powerful weapon I can offer to those who still feel trapped in the same shadows I once called home. Establishing that foundation wasn't just about providing legal support or financial education. It was about creating a space where the logic of the predator is finally named, understood, and dismantled. It was never the legacy Sydney and Edwin wanted for their father's name, but in the end, they were never the ones who truly carried it. My life in Carmel is not a retreat, but a reclamation of the self that I had buried beneath 22 years of managing the expectations, the moods, and the failures of a family that never truly saw me. I take watercolor classes. I volunteer at the local animal shelter. And I have formed friendships based on simple, human connection rather than the cold, transactional nature of the Whitaker family's internal politics. For the first time, I am accountable to no one but myself, and that autonomy is the greatest gift I have ever received. I want you to know that if you are currently standing in a place where your value is being measured by your bank account or your willingness to submit to the demands of others, you have the power to change the narrative. You are not a prop in someone else's story of greed. You are the author of your own resilience, and the moment you decide that your peace of mind is worth more than their approval is the moment you start to win. I hope my journey reminds you that you are smarter, stronger, and more capable than the people trying to minimize you could ever hope to comprehend. Please, before we end this, tell me, what does it mean to you to finally claim your own life on your own terms? Have you ever felt the weight of a legacy you were expected to carry, only to realize that the only way to be free was to let it go entirely? Let's talk about it in the comments below, because your voice matters just as much as mine. Thank you for walking this road with me, for listening to the truth of what it means to survive and thrive, and for reminding me that we are never truly alone when we stand for what is right. End. This story is not merely a chronicle of betrayal and inheritance. It is a profound testament to the resilience of the human spirit when faced with the cold machinery of greed. At its heart, Colleen's journey reveals that the most dangerous traps are often set by those who use the language of family and love to mask their predatory intentions. The Whitaker brothers operated under the assumption that Colleen was a passive, replaceable figure in their father's life, a tragic miscalculation born from their own inflated sense of entitlement. They were blinded by the illusion of their own cleverness, never realizing that they were walking into a structural trap their father had meticulously designed to ensure his true values and his true partner were protected. In the end, their pursuit of a fortune they didn't earn led them to inherit only the debt they deserved, proving that true power cannot be inherited, only cultivated through integrity and foresight. The most profound lesson we can extract from this is that your value is never defined by what others, even those closest to you, decide you are worth. In our own lives, we often find ourselves in situations where we shrink to fit the expectations of others, fearing that standing our ground will lead to isolation or ruin. However, Colleen's experience teaches us that silence is not the same as weakness, and patience is the most potent form of strategy. To apply this, you must learn to detach your emotional well-being from the transactional nature of those who seek to use you. When you encounter individuals who weaponize your kindness or your desire for harmony, do not react with the same bitterness they wield. Instead, maintain your clarity, document the reality of your situation, and prepare to protect.